Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest in a series of webinars being uh, provided by the Urban Big Data Centre. I expect we'll see a few stragglers, so there's a few co-hosts can let those people in from the waiting room as we go forward. My name is Andrew McHugh. I'm the Senior Data Science Manager at the Urban Big Data Centre. Uh, I'll introduce the proceedings in a moment, but I just wanted to deal with a couple of matters of housekeeping first. The first is that this session is being recorded and it's concurrently being streamed live on YouTube, albeit to an unlisted channel. The recording, though, once edited, will be also published on our YouTube channel. So if you're uncomfortable with that, please do bear that in mind. The session will be around 2 hours or so in total. We've got a number of different speakers planned, as well as some interactive elements later on. For those who are unfamiliar with the Urban Big Data Centre, we're a centre based at the University of Glasgow. We have two principal functions. The first is as a traditional research centre. Our areas of interest and our focuses are on cities and specifically the use of new and emerging forms of data to provide new insights and understanding of how cities function, how their residents behave and interact, and how they flourish and prosper. Um, we also, our second function is we run on behalf of the Economic and Social Research Council, effectively on behalf of the UK government. We operate a national data service where we seek to make data and insights and capacity more accessible to a range of different kinds of audiences, mainly within the UK. In this webinar today, Making Data Readable, Dashboards, Information Visualization, and Accessible Evidence, really aligns both of those functions. It's a conclusion to a small piece of work we've been developing within the centre to better understand some of the challenges of having our academic outputs, our analyses, and our data being used more regularly and more integrally by uh, public sector, local government, different parts of government. Um, we've been identifying or seeking to identify what are the challenges of adoption of these kinds of academic outputs for the use within policy work and operational work within government organizations. And we think one of the main challenges has been the accessibility, the usability of these data sets and outputs and analyses. And we've sought to develop our understanding of how to make data more readable, to make it more accessible. And then that is often been achieved through the development of things like dashboards and information visualization and so on. So in the agenda that will follow, as I say, for the next 2 hours or so, we'll hear from a number of people, from colleagues within UBDC, as well as just one external speaker now. I'm afraid we'd planned to have two, but unfortunately, one of our speakers has has fallen ill. So Stephen Sprott from Glasgow City Council will no longer be able to join us. But we will hear from Jaime Villacampa from Public Health Scotland shortly. After a series of speakers, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. I would invite people throughout the session to add any questions they have into the chat. We'll deal with those around 10:45 when we'll have heard from our speakers, and we'll deal with them all together. But please do pose questions to any of the speakers or any other discussion points around that. And then laterally, we'll break into a breakout session where we'll each be tasked with responding to a specific scenario and trying to come up with some ideas based on the understanding we've hopefully developed throughout the preceding talks. So I think that is probably all I'll need to say at the very start as far as an introduction. I'll now pass over to my colleague Justine Gagnon, and I'll invite Justine to share her screen. And Justine will offer us an initial overview on information and data dashboards, just to contextualize the contributions that will follow. So take it away, Justine.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much and welcome everybody. So my name is Justin and I'm a research associate at the Urban Big Data Center. And today I'm going to provide a very brief overview of what dashboards are, what are the different types, and give you some examples of dashboards. Okay, so why can't I move? Oh, here you go. So here I will start with a definition. I have a very classic thing to do. So the first one is kind of an old definition that was created in 2006, and it sort of takes from the idea of car dashboard, this idea of a visual display where the most important information needed to achieve one or more objective is consolidated and arranged on a single screen. So here we can really see the idea of car dashboard with different visual displays there. And everything needed to be monitored at one glance. And more recently, though, I think with the emergence of different types of dashboards, this definition has been kind of elaborated on, and dashboard, kind of single screen dashboard, have become more like platforms. And here, so the second definition by Kitching and Mark-Harley is specifically around urban dashboard, but I think can be applied across the board. And again, if you're interested in dashboard, I would really recommend the work of Kitching and Mark-Harley, and I've provided references at the end, so you can look into that in further detail if you're interested. So they define dashboard as platform which use visual analytics to display information about the performance, structure, patterns, and trend of cities. And here I have added our subject at and so the visualization can include gauges, traffic light colors, meters, arrows, bar chart, graphs, but also more recently interactive visualization such as map, heat maps, and that has been very much emerging at the same time as the GIS technology and the opening up of new types of data collected from sensors or connected infrastructure that gives you more real-time data. So in the past 2 decades, I'm sure you've seen many dashboards, and there's been an explosion of dashboards, publicly accessible, but also within organization. And as I said, has been combined with kind of data being more accessible, maybe an increase in collection of data, and also the maturing of a field of business analytics, where basically data is used on a more like daily basis to make decision, or at least trying to make decision and inform policy making. And here you can see vendors such as Tableau or Microsoft that kind of have released a range of products that offer business analytics tools, among which dashboard, and I'm sure you're aware of, for example, Power BI, that is widely used in organizations. So to move on, I just wanted to flag up like the multiplicity of dashboards and also the various purposes for which you can use them. And this is just some of the terminology around dashboard that's been put forward by Sarikaya and O in 2019. And you will quickly become aware that there is a lot of terminology around dashboard. I will just flag up 3 of the main key terms here. So the first one is what we will call operational dashboards, and their purpose is to control and monitor the current activity or performance. So that's really like a short kind of time frame and shows like operational processes. So for instance, you can think of customer contacts dashboards. And generally they have like a really high level of granularity around this specific topic they're looking at. And they're using or trying to use as near as possible real-time data so it can inform and support decision-making around operational needs. So it's really immediate decision-making. The second type is strategic dashboard. So here the purpose is to evaluate and manage strategic objectives. And sometimes they're also used for benchmarking services or policy against targets. And I'm sure you will be aware of key performance indicators. And in that case, they might also be known as performance dashboards. So here the level of data is much more high level. Often you have like data throughout time, so you can allow comparison over time. And that's to help and to support long-term decision making and often these dashboards are kind of focusing on around specific policy area and are simple, decluttered information that do not require specific data skills. In organizations, they're often used by senior level management decision maker. And that's by contrast with more analytical dashboards. And here, and obviously these definitions are kind of overlapping, but analytical dashboard, the purpose is to gain insights from a variety of data sets and sources. So basically they are more complex and contain a large amount of data. And here the purpose is really to gain insight within this data. They are allowed to drill into the data. They use complex analytical models. They might use predictive modeling, etc. And they are targeted as more business analytics and experts. So here you do need for this type of dashboard more advanced data skills, and they provide queries, options, and functionalities. Other terminology includes tactical dashboard, urban dashboard. So it's really not an exact science, but it's quite interesting to look at what type fit what purposes when you're starting thinking about designing a dashboard. And finally, a last element around distinguishing between different dashboards is around accessibility. So dashboards are more or less accessible or open to the public. So that varies accordingly to what the audience of the dashboard is and the purpose of the dashboard. So for example, some dashboards might be entirely private. So thinking about your dashboard or activity log on Strava, for example, other one might be only accessible within an organization or within a department within an organization, so more like organizational internal dashboards, and other ones are publicly accessible, for example, urban dashboards. And sometimes the latter can be also embedded within open data portals or data stores. That is something that is starting emerging. Here in the UK, you might have heard of the London data store, but you also have open data portal here in Glasgow or in Bristol and so on. So now I'm just going to provide you with a few examples of dashboards, and hopefully that will trigger some discussion around their different characteristics and performances. So the first one is the Dublin dashboard here. And I think it's a very good example of an urban dashboard, and you have many of them in the UK or across the world, actually. It's been revamped recently, so it's been changed. The design has been changed, but that's a dashboard that's been existing for the past 7 years. And it contains information about Dublin, and it's clustered around key themes. So here, transport, environment, housing, the economy, education, and demographic. And this is often the case when you look at different urban dashboards. You have different clusters that kind of relate to different policy domains. And you can find near real-time data indicators on some of this theme, and more like statistical data on other of this theme. So this is a picture here on the right as well of the dashboard, and I've provided the link. So this dashboard is quite interesting because it has been a partnership between the Dublin City Council and the University of Dublin, and some scholars have actually worked and studied it and studied the process of development of this dashboard. And we have quite a lot of information about this dashboard. So here I've just put the data that is used and put to feed the dashboard. And so you can see interesting thing emerging. So it's different data providers. So from the public sector, like the Dublin City Council, but also from the private sector, like GCDECO for the Dublin Bags, for example. So a variety of data providers, but also a variety of type of data. So it's real-time data. So what you can see on the left, and non-real-time data, so more statistical data that is either monthly or annually. So it's really different temporalities as well. And finally here, I would also point out to the different data formats. So you have format that are more like PDF or CSV format, but also data coming from API or data being presented in JSON as well. So it's really a variety of provider formats and types of data, which I think it's important to think about when you starting looking at designing and creating a dashboard. Another example, and I will go a bit faster here, but is the Bristol Air Quality Dashboard. And this one is connected to the open data portal of the city that I mentioned earlier. So it's real-time data on air quality in different locations, taken from sensors that are plugged around the city. So you can see on the left here, you also have a performance visualization. When it's low, it's low pollution is in green, then middle pollution orange, and high pollution red, and so on. And you also have a spatial representation of where the sensors are and the performance against targeted and specific pollutant here that you can see on the right. It's kind of an example of a performance dashboard combined with kind of geospatial representation here. The third example I wanted to highlight is the Scottish Tech Army COVID-19 dashboard. It's one among many examples of COVID-19 dashboard. I'm sure you've seen some of them in the past a month. So this one has been created by a volunteer from the tech sector in Scotland, and is drawing on available data from various sources. And here, the functionalities are around, you can select cases, so either cases or number of deaths, and then you can look at that in specific area, either health board or council area, and you also have daily count, but you can compare over time. So that provides like various functionalities, kind of diving deep down into the COVID-19 data in Scotland. Again, I've provided the link, so feel free to look at it at your leisure. The next example I wanted to highlight this morning is the Edmonton Citizen Dashboard. So Edmonton is a city in Canada, and they have provided here with an example of performance dashboard, and they've centered this dashboard around policy domain. So again, transportation, livability, environment. And when you click on the tabs, you can really see a series of policy targets and whether or not these targets have been met. Again, with a color coding, like traffic light color coding, so red, orange, and green. What's interesting here is also something to note is the data is not really real. It's obviously not real time, and it kind of reflects the pace of policymaking and maybe evaluation of policy as well. So not all dashboards are actually real time. And the final example I wanted to flag up this morning, and again, there are many dashboards that you can look at, but this one is the Uber movement city dashboards. So basically, I thought it was interesting to bring up example of a dashboard that's been put forward using private.
Sorry to interrupt. Just I apologize for the slides aren't progressing. I'm not sure if they are on your screen, but on the Zoom,
they are on my
still seeing
screen.
the
I'm
Bristol.
sorry. So maybe I should stop sharing and start sharing again.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's fine. They were progressing on the screen. Can you see it now?
Yeah, we see the Uber movement city dashboard now.
Perfect. So we're just going to start again from there. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
And I will circulate the slides so people can also click on the different links. So that's the last one I wanted to show this morning. And I was saying that's interesting to see our private sector data can also be utilized in that way. And there's a huge potential around private sector data, but often it is not accessible to the public, or it requires licensing. And I think we've seen the potential it can have with Google Mobility Dashboard, for example, in the context of COVID-19. So it's quite positive to see that some of this data is made somehow accessible for the public. So here, you can basically calculate travel times in different cities. So I've chosen Paris, obviously, but yeah, from the origin and destination zones, and it kind of gives you calculate an average traveling time at specific at the time of the day, and also gives you traveling times by periods, so morning peaks or like afternoon peaks and so on. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at mobility using the Uber data. Finally, just some food for thought when we're thinking about dashboards and maybe using dashboard and designing dashboard, I would say the first thing to think about is identifying the targeted audience or audiences and what their needs are. So we are sure that we can define the scope and the purpose of the dashboard, and maybe looking at the different types and what level of granularity you need to answer your audience needs. So what questions do they have, and what level of granularity do they need? Then obviously you have some issue to think about around the sourcing of the data. And I think the Dublin dashboard example shows that there are various sources of data you can use, but you really need to think about the sustainability of your source. So is it going to be continuous and be usable over time? Is data, thinking about data quality and consistency, as well as I said, licensing. Another area of things that you need to think about is around visualization, and Janet is going to tell us more about that. But there's been an emerging field of research around the politic of representations when it comes to dashboards, and what you represent and what you omit to represent, and how to also contextualize that data. So it's really something to be aware of, that representing data is not necessarily neutral, and that really needs to feed into your user need, but also the scope of the dashboard. And finally, two more technical kind of thing to think about. So the usability, accessibility of your dashboard. So thinking about the digital literacy and skills of your targeted audiences is very important, as well as the accessibility requirements more generally. And finally, the technical infrastructure. So which platform do you want to use? Do you want to code it from scratch, or do you want to use specific software and tools that can create a dashboard, knowing that then you would be restricted with that platform? Where do you want to host it? How do you store the data? And how do you ensure that data is secure? So that is me. And these are some of the references I use. As I said, Robert Kitching is quite a big name if you want to dive more into the field of dashboard and urban data. So I've provided some example here for you, and I will circulate the slides.
Many thanks, Justine. And yeah, that's a good point. We'll make sure that all of the slides and all of the materials that we cover today will be circulated to all of the registered attendees. As I said, we'll store up questions. I don't see any in the chat at the moment, and I should invite those watching on YouTube as well to by all means put their questions within the live chat there. That's also being monitored, and we'll come to those in due course. But we'll turn on now to the next agenda item today, which, as I said earlier, was originally planned to be 2 external speakers, and unfortunately we're down to just one. But what we'd hoped to achieve in this section was to offer a look at a couple of many case studies to understand how government and public sector organizations use dashboards already. What are some of the motivations, and what are some of the needs, and how effectively are those needs addressed, and can they be addressed with the development of these kinds of technologies? In addition to our first external speaker, Jaime Villacampa from Public Health Scotland, we'll also hear from subsequently from our own colleague in UBDC, Jeanette Bahor, and she'll offer another bit of insight about a dashboard we've jointly developed with Glasgow City Region. So we'll get another external perspective from there, albeit from a UBDC voice. But I will hand over now to Jaime Villacampa. Jaime is the Principal Information Analyst at Public Health Scotland. And what he's going to be talking about is I think it's the SCOFO Online Profiles Tool app, which gives an overview of health and its wider determinants at a local level. So I think, Jaime, you should be set to share your screens. So feel free to unmute and do so, and take it away. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much, Andrew. So yeah, as Andrew was saying, I work in Public Health Scotland, and I work in the Scottish Public Health Observatory team, which we call it SCOTFO. So I'll refer as it as SCOTFO. So I'm just going to share my screen and come to the first page. And okay, so I hope everyone can see this. So I'm going to start explaining a little bit about what these profiles tool are. So we have over 200 indicators of public health, and it's wider determinant. So we look at things like health outcomes that could be like people hospitalized by asthma, or people dying prematurely by different reasons. But we also look at the wider determinants of health. So we look at education, housing, economy, and different measures of these things to try to give a better overview of what is going on in terms of health and well-being in a community. So all of these indicators are grouped by themes and topics, which is what we call a profile. So we have profiles on health and well-being, which is like a summary, but we have some focused on children and young people, on drugs, on alcohol, on a few different topics. Our tool is used by many different types of users. So it's heavily used by national and local government, and this includes people in policy posts, but also people more in analytical posts. So it's quite a big range of technical and data savviness in our users. Is used a lot by people in local government, as I said, is council and partnerships, but also health boards, and then is generally used by the general public, as all of our information is publicly available. And that includes academia, so a lot of researchers use it, and students in different degrees of public health and information in general. And because of that, it also has a lot of different uses. So there is people that use it for benchmarking between different areas and for their like end of year reports and that kind of things. Also for improvement. There is it's quite used recently for teaching in universities, for research. A lot of our users, this is one of the few places where they can find the information, so they use it just as an open data platform. We've got an area where they can just download the data, so they just go there and pick it from there. So while we created it, so there was a clear need for local data that was not published in the official publications that Public Health Scotland or Scottish Government or other organisations published. And that type of local data is when you start to go down into community level. So if you go down to intermediate zone or localities data for the different councils. So also a lot of this information is or was, I'll argue that is still very highly compartmentalized. You go to one organization and then you find the data that organization published and nothing else. And usually is one publication where you can find data on hospital activity, but it's not linked to any of the other factors and measures that affect this hospital activity. So we wanted to create something where users could get a good summary of the health and well-being for a particular area. And we used to have a dashboard in the past that it was built in JavaScript by IT, and we were not the developers, and we have to request any sort of modification to them. And then we moved to R/Shine, and then we became the developers, and that helped us to be very flexible and be able to meet the demands of our users in terms of what geographies levels they wanted to show, what type of information, new indicators, new measures. So I did decide to not do a live demo because it was quite a short time presentation, and this is much better. So this is the landing page of the profiles tool. So there are a number of different tabs. So we've tried to make sure that the needs of all of the different types of our users are met in the different tabs. So a lot of our users just want to have a quick overview of the data and for an area, and that's where we have a profile summary where they can just obtain that. Some of our users only want the data, and they're just going to reuse it in their own way for their own areas and their own purposes, and that's where we get a different tab for the data. And then a lot of users are only interested in a particular measure. So for example, we work a lot with alcohol and drug partnerships, and they might be interested in the alcohol related admissions for the area or the set of communities where they work with. So we have provided a number of different breakdowns to look at different measures in more detail. So there's one for looking at changes over time. There's one for look at the comparison between areas, and then there's one where we look at the health inequality, so how socioeconomic deprivation affects that measure. So this is something that we are putting quite a lot of effort in the recent time, just as it's a very important breakdown of the data. So this is what the users see when they click on the summary tab. So the colors indicate if an indicator is doing better, worse, or similarly to a comparator. So in the top, they can select the different geography level, and we go from the Scotland level up to down intermediate zone, which is a very small geography level that is just the closest that we can get to a neighborhood concept. And then they can select a profile, and in this case, it's the health and well-being, and then they can select a comparison. So they can compare against, in this case, it's Scotland, but they could be comparing an intermediate zone against the council area where this intermediate zone is. But we want to allow users to not only do benchmarking, which is very, let's say, pointless sometimes. Is who's doing better and worse. Like there's a lot of factors and local in the local trends that need to be considered, but also how they're doing over time. So they can look at if in 2005 teenage child health weight in primary one was doing better than now or worse. So we try to put a very focus on improvement as well. So in the boxes, we've used this set of colors all over the dashboard. So blue is doing better, orange is doing worse, and gray is doing similarly. And then there's somewhere there's no difference that can be calculated. So we call this a conversation starter. So users can look at this and start to try to understand the issues and the strong points of the community, and they can bring this to the table to discuss. As I said, there needs to be a lot of local knowledge into this data because, yeah, again, there's lots of factors that we don't really know, so they can try to factor that in. They have different ways of seeing to this data as well, so they can see a trend chart, which is very similar, but they can see how the numbers have been changing over time. So this one, for example, is quite an interesting one because, as you can see, smoking during pregnancy was doing worse than the comparator, and then eventually it's got better than it. And when we drill into the different indicators, this is, for example, for alcohol-related hospital admissions, and they can see the changes over time. We calculate confidence intervals because we go down to very small local areas. There's quite a lot of random variation in the data, so we try to provide confidence intervals so users can try to understand if variation is within what will be expected or is actually just something a bit more extraordinary and worth paying attention to. We in the next slide, this shows the rank comparison, so the users can see a set of areas, in this case health boards, and how they rate compared to Scotland, and they can also look at it in a map. We've provided this for all of the different areas. So, for example, this is alcohol-related hospital stays for Glasgow, and when you actually go to the smaller areas, this provides a lot better drill down of the data and a lot more insights on how different communities can be doing. And as I mentioned, we also add comparison over time. So for alcohol-related hospital stays, the changes within council area. And here you can see, for example, Glasgow in 2002 was here, in 2017 is here, so it's been doing better. But you can see the size of some of the improvements, or you can see where areas have been getting worse over time. So we think this is a very useful way of looking at the data as well. And for health inequalities, we divide the population in 20%, and then we just show the deprivation gradient and how affects, in this case, deaths, all ages. We've tried to summarize this information as well in a simpler way, so giving some key headlines, figures for the data, so users can understand the information quicker than just having to try to figure out what is the key message from it. And as I mentioned, we just have a data tab where the users can select basically every bit of data that they want. And this is very used by a range of different analysts that work on local councils or partnerships and so on. So the impact of the dashboard. So it has helped us meet our user needs. We've done a lot of usability testing and a lot of user engagement and received a lot of user feedback, and we have been trying to implement it. So there's been quite a lot of changes just to try to make sure that we were meeting the needs of our users. I think one way that we've measured the impact as well is we used to receive a lot of ad hoc requests for data and for different bits of information, and that's basically dropped to 0 in the last 3 years because we are actually providing the information that they need. We also have usage statistics through Google Analytics, and that show that, yeah, we have got a very healthy user community that they use it continuously. And we are trying to look more into provide users with evidence for action, so move from just providing them with data, but actually being like, okay, so your area has an issue with this particular topic. This is some solutions that have been working across Scotland on this topic, so you can actually start to action the data that we provide you. And we are trying to develop a series of impact cases, so looking at how our users are using this information for in the local areas and how is making an impact. And I think another thing that is worth noting is that we've moved to a much more efficient process. It's very simple for us now to produce new information, change to meet our user needs, and it's been very good as well for staff development in terms of learning R, Shiny. We use GitHub as well, so all those skills have been spread across the team and across other teams. And this was one of the first dashboards created in R Shiny in Public Health Scotland, and now we have a lot of them that have been using this one as a template. So it's been a pretty good process in that way. And I just got like some links and contact here that I'll share the presentation afterwards. All of our data, as I said, is freely available. Our code is available in GitHub as well, and we are always welcoming questions or feedback. So just drop me a message if you want. And that's me.
Okay, thank you very much, Jaime. That was fantastic. Really comprehensive overview of what looks like a really great resource. As I said, I'll keep making the case, keep asking for folks to pop their questions in the chat, and we'll get to them just after the next talk. And I won't spend too long introducing this, but you'll hear from my Urban Big Data Center colleague, Jeanette Bahor, who's going to explain how we will go about this process of first of all, identifying needs and seeking then to align those with appropriate data sets, appropriate presentation approaches and interactivity. So, take it away, Jeanette.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. So hopefully you should all see that in presentation mode. Great. Okay, good morning, everybody. Glad that you've made it along this morning to our webinar presentation. So my name is Jeanette Bahor. I'm a data analyst and dashboard developer at UBDC. And this morning, I'm going to be trying to talk about how you might go about building your own dashboards in terms of identifying needs and aligning these with data, and in terms of how best to present these data and make sure that they're engaging and encourage interactivity. So Justine has already given a really good introduction to dashboards, but I'll quickly give you a bit of a background on why I think design matters. So obviously data and analytics over the past decade has become really important in decision making. And in this sense, dashboards have become a standard tool over this last decade in terms of communicating data and insights. So dashboards can be really useful, as I say, in communicating data effectively, also at highlighting important information, starting evidence-based guided conversations, and ultimately, in many cases, driving action. They can sort of provide a lot of benefits over things like static reports or sort of data tables in Excel, as you might be using already. Because they can provide a sort of real-time interface where you can collate different sources of data and look at both historical as well as up-to-date data to inform decisions. I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody that unfortunately, sometimes if dashboards or certainly even web interfaces are designed poorly, they end up doing the opposite, and they fail to engage users. They also fail to convey key insights and can often make data more confusing and less comprehensible. So this morning, what I'll try and do is sort of give you tips that I think would sort of help you design something that is quite engaging and can result in a fairly high quality dashboard, hopefully. So I think the first and foremost most important thing to consider when you're designing a dashboard is considering who your users are. So you need to, basically the ultimate thing in terms of dashboard is that you want to communicate something. So in order to make this engaging as possible, you need to identify who your target audience is and get to know them. So it's really important to know what user context, what their motivation, what their needs are. And it's important to identify your target audience as well as a sort of broader audience if there is one. And many dashboards can have multiple audiences in this sense. So you will want to identify as many of them as possible right up front. And many of them will want different levels of detail. So identifying them upfront will help you sort of prioritize what to include in the dashboard and what they will be looking for. And some of the questions you might want to ask in this context are: who is your anticipated audience? What is their role within the organization or the group that you are designing this dashboard for? What do they already know? What kind of level of data literacy do they have? So this will inform how much context you need to give when you present information. And then finally, the most important bit is what do they need to know, or what do they want to know and gain from the dashboard you are designing? So more specifically, what questions do they need answering when they are coming to your dashboard, and what kind of information are they looking to take away from it? So whether this will be sort of a high level overview of performance, or want to sort of drill down further into the data, look at things like historical insights and things like this. So then we get to think about what is the purpose of the dashboard. So purpose will obviously inform design in terms of presentation and the level of detail that you will need to include. So this is something you need to be clear about what you're trying to achieve with the dashboard you're creating right up front. And this may be one or a combination of lots of different things, such as seeing the bigger picture, or focusing on specific operational metrics, or even getting a sort of deep dive into the information and being able to explore certain questions in relation to a topic. And Justine has very nicely outlined the different dashboards there may be, so I'm not going to go into any detail, but these will sort of inform the purpose behind the dashboard itself. And some of the questions that you may want to consider here is just remember what value the dashboard you're designing will be adding to both, well, to the organization and the group that you will be designing it for. And then also consider how your end users will want to use the dashboard. So will it be something that's explanatory in terms of what is being shown, or are they expecting something where they can sort of explore and draw their own insights in terms of what is being shown? So here is an important concept to remember. The part of the need for identifying these sort of user needs and purposes early is that so you can streamline what you end up including in your dashboard. And so ultimately you want to select indicators that meet identified needs, and you only really want to include what's important and support the board's intent that you've identified earlier, because you don't want to be overwhelmed with the data that is being shown. So you want to choose data that translates into meaningful information. So again, this is coming back to the users and making sure that it fits the end user needs and can be interpreted in sort of business terms, or, you know, what's useful to them, what they're actually interested in. And then it also fits this purpose of the dashboard. So are you showing the data that they are looking to get, and is it at the level that they are hoping to get out of it? So then when it comes to deciding on what exact data to include, there are some considerations that you might want to think about here. So first of all, is obviously the obvious factor is what's actually available in terms of data. So you might, as Justine showed with the Dublin dashboard, a lot of data comes from different sources. So you might want to identify whether there's data out there from different places that you could inquire about and you could get and bring into the dashboard to sort of inform and answer those questions that you really need answering. Moreover, is the data that you have identified, is it granular enough to answer the questions that you really need answering? So like Jaime says, if you're interested in health at a local level, is it enough if the data only shows something at, say, a much larger geography, i.e. for the entirety of Glasgow? Is that going to be answering the questions that you need to know about, say, neighbourhoods within Glasgow? And then obviously there's this idea of that you want to make sure that the data you're including in a dashboard is of high quality. So this includes obviously the obvious one, to make sure that the data is accurate, but also is it complete in terms of, does it provide a complete picture of what you're trying to explain, what you're trying to understand? So is the data sort of representative and accurate in that sense? And then there's this idea of timeliness and continuity. So if you're using some data, is it updated often enough that it can answer those questions that you are looking for answers to, you know, often enough, and can it be informative in that sense? And is it something that will continue to be updated going forward, or is it sort of a one-off historical data that will not help give you a real-time picture of different things? And then finally, there's two things that you should obviously always be careful of when working with any sort of data, but especially when it comes to things like dashboard, and that's to consider things like data privacy and any sort of data licensing issues. So you want to make sure that any data shared through a dashboard doesn't sort of break any confidentiality or contractual agreements. Say if you are using data in your dashboard that is otherwise not made publicly available, then it's probably not a good idea to sort of put this on a web platform for everybody to see and everybody to access. So there's some things there that need thinking about in advance. And you can always implement things like, you know, anonymization or sort of disclosure control, but it's always important to sort of tread carefully when using any sort of data, and especially if you're designing a dashboard that will be sort of open and available to all. So I just want to include a case study that of a project that we've done recently within UBDC, just to give you an idea of how you might approach a problem in real life in terms of thinking about your audience and your purpose. So this was a project that we made for the Glasgow City region, basically it was an economic dashboard. So our audience here were local authorities within this Glasgow City region, and anyone else who was interested in sort of economic data in that sense. And the purpose of it was to deliver a demonstrative dashboard that provided insights on economic activity at these city region levels and meet local policy and operational needs. So the data we were given actually in advance that had already been collated from openly shared data by the government and from various different places. So we didn't really have to go looking for that. But essentially, we ended up obviously identifying specific needs which helped drive the design of the dashboard itself. So the most specific one was that local authorities were really interested in getting an overview at the level of their own authority within the Glasgow City region of these economic indicators, but then also be able to compare them between each other, and then also compare the Glasgow City region to other city regions within the UK. Obviously, there was a need to make it sort of user-friendly and have a simple interface because of this requirement that everyone could, sort of use it, and that it was accessible to everybody, and there wasn't sort of any requirement in terms of understanding where the data was coming from and how it was being used. And then the main need that sort of informed what kind of tool we ended up going with was this idea that they really wanted to be able to sort of create reports and export some of the visualizations and have sort of custom PDF printouts of specific authorities, local authorities, and also have these comparisons that they could take away and share amongst themselves. So the end result, and yes, it plays great. So was this dashboard created in our Shiny that first of all gives you this overview of a local authority where you can download the data, and then also this other page of where you can compare different local authorities within that Glasgow City region and look at specific indicators. And similarly to the ScotFlow app, you can compare them to a certain area and look at this in different ways, as well as download the data. And then we have this third sort of tab where you could compare those different city regions within the UK in a similar format and be able to download the data both as a CSV alongside some of the graphs, and then also as a PDF custom report. So how do you end up putting this all into action? So this is actually somewhat of the fun part, is when you start designing the actual dashboard itself. So there's lots and lots of different resources on the internet giving you advice on what kind of design is best and how you might want to approach the design aspect of the thing. One thing they all agree on is that it's really important to make sure that your design is straightforward. So this starts with ensuring that the information that you're showing obviously is as clear as possible, and the most relevant information and these sort of key take-home messages are clear at a glance, so that you're making it simple for the user to understand what you're trying to communicate with them. And this can be done obviously by providing labels or providing a little bit of context, but there's no sort of, for example, there's no sort of scenario where someone has to sort of go away and calculate things for themselves, because it isn't obvious at that sort of first glance. In the same context, if you want to make a dashboard user-friendly, then one of the biggest and most important advice is that you want to avoid clutter. So as I said before, you don't only just want to streamline the data you include, but you want to streamline the design of it, and you want to avoid detracting from what's important. So some things you can use here are things like interactivity, where you can, present the data by asking the user to select a certain area so that you don't have to show all the areas at one point if it's something similar to like the ScotFlow app, and you can have different indicators at different area levels. So there's two examples here on the bottom where you can see that this sort of idea where everything is being shown, you just don't know where to begin, and it's quite overwhelming, and it's quite difficult to see what those key take-home messages are and what should be taken away from a dashboard like that. Whereas the second example is a little bit more easy on the eye, It still has a lot of information, but it allows the user to sort of select certain things and is a lot more forgiving in a way, and sort of allows you to go explore in your own time. So in this same sense, obviously, it's important to use good visual organization when you design your dashboards. So make it clear, like I say, to the user what's important, what you should be taking away. And you can use things like sizing, position of different widgets, as well as grouping to show things like hierarchy. You can use this sort of bottom down, upside down pyramid idea, if that's helpful, to sort of, you know, have the most important information up top and then give more detail as you go further down the page. You might want to consider, well, it's really important to consider how people consume visual representations. So there's lots of great studies on this as well on the internet, looking at eye tracking and how people consume a web page or a dashboard, for example. And one thing that they all agree on is that things like big numbers matter, and also the most visually attractive part of a dashboard tends to be that sort of top part of the dashboard, but also a little bit to the left. I don't need to tell you, I'm sure, that it's really important to use the right type of chat when it comes to representing data. Is obviously this aids your understanding in what you take away from it. I don't want to go into detail because there is lots of stuff on this on the internet as well, but obviously the idea is to try and communicate clearly as possible what you're trying to show. So again, it really matters what type of chat you use and in terms of communicating this. And then finally, obviously, design is great and fun, but it's obviously important to keep it clean and consistent. So this idea about using colors, obviously color can be really useful. It can really make or break a dashboard. As you can see on the left, if you don't use any colors, it's quite difficult to see what the key home messages of a dashboard are, and the obvious fact that it's not particularly visually appealing. And then if you do use colors, something to be wary of is the fact that some colors can obviously represent certain things within our culture. So if you use the color red, that can have negative connotations and can imply things like error or danger or things like this. So always make sure that you use colors sparingly. It's quite good advice to maybe limit your use of color to 2 or 3 colors. Try and keep them consistent as you go within the dashboard. What you might want to do is play with sort of tone and things like that instead of using lots of different colors all in one go. And then finally, there's this idea that you should also make sure that the colors you use are accessible and are accessible to people who are visually impaired. And there's lots of tools out there that you can test your dashboards and your websites on this to make sure that they are. So then it comes to obviously picking the right tool, and there's lots and lots of great data visualization tools out there. These are just some of the examples on the right. Some things you might want to consider when you're choosing what kind of tool to use is obviously this idea of how much it costs to first of all obtain or use the software or the tool, but also maybe to sort of host your end dashboard. That's quite important as well. There's also this idea of how much level of expertise is required to first of all create the dashboard and also to maintain the dashboard in the long run. So as Jaime alluded to, using RShiny, it's really useful, and it's obviously free over some paid for softwares like Tableau, but it also requires a knowledge of sort of being able to code in R, which is obviously not for everybody. And software like Tableau will allow you to avoid having to do that by having this sort of drag and drop idea. Also the ability to have key features. So not all of your tools will allow for this. So as I showed you earlier in the economic dashboard that we created, there was this need to be able to have these downloadable reports, which RShiny is great at doing, but some other tools might not account for. Also this idea of accessibility through other devices. So if I want to look at a dashboard through a mobile phone, for example, then a web page might be great at doing that. But if I also want to be able to view it offline, then obviously a web page is probably not the right way to go. So you need to think about how people will be using the dashboards in the longer term. And then probably one of the biggest deciding factors might be your user preference, the preference of your users, and whether they're already familiar with a tool such as Power BI, for example. Then you might want to go ahead with that instead, because it will mean that there's a better chance of uptake in the first place, but also a better chance of engagement in the long run. And then obviously, unfortunately, in most cases, your job is not done just once you've created the dashboard. You need to think about how you might want to future-proof it. So think about how your users will use the dashboard in the long term. So like I say, if they want to use it offline, maybe, then it's good to try and think about this at the design stages right at the beginning, so that you can account for this and choose the right tool. But there's also some considerations around who will maybe maintain and manage the solution after you deploy it. So if there's data behind the tool that is there, then who will be updating this? Or if it's connected to live data sources, then who will be there to fix it when APIs break, or databases change location or structure or something like that. And obviously, as data becomes more available and changes, or questions may change that people are looking to answer when they come to your dashboard, you might want to be updating the different versions of a dashboard. My final tip this morning would be to keep evolving your dashboards. So always remember that the ultimate goal of a dashboard is to communicate with your users. So you want to sort of, if you can, have this iterative process. As Jaime perfectly said, you want to involve your users, not just right at the beginning, but also once you've created the dashboard. So you want to think about what the purpose of it is, what are your users' needs and requirements, how can you make it easy for them to understand, how can you make it easy for them to access the information, make it clear to them, and then try and get feedback off them and see if you can keep improving it. And this will make sure that not only is there high uptake of your dashboard right from the beginning, but that you can maintain this sort of engagement going forward in the long run. And I've included some resources. The internet is absolutely brimming with lots and lots of useful things that you can read on dashboard design, including some of the things I mentioned this morning and more. So these are just some examples, and as with all the other speakers, these slides will be shared, so all those links will be available to you. So thank you very much, and I think, I don't know if we still have time for questions, but that gets us up to our question and answer session, so I'll pass it back to Andrew. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and yeah, really excellent presentation there, really full overview. I mean, inevitably with the time constraints, we can't offer comprehensive insights into how to build these dashboards, but a really systematic set of steps you've presented there, and hopefully has given people a real clear idea of what many of the considerations are when approaching these problems. Yeah, we will still absolutely have questions. I know that Jaime, I'm not sure, is able to stay for the full duration, so it's particularly important that we pose our questions to him just now. I've had one from YouTube. Joseph J, I'll ask on Joseph's behalf. Not sure if you're taking questions here, but both speakers have recommended R Shiny. Is this a good package for all dashboarding needs, or is it the recommendation for users that are good at R already? I don't know if Jeanette or Jaime have an opinion on that.
I guess it depends on where your technical skill lies. I mean, R Shiny is pretty good to build it without knowing too much of HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So that reduces the entry level that you require to build a dashboard. It's also very active and in very active development. And if you I use R for my data analysis, so it just makes sense as the workflow of work. I think also it has an advantage over like Tableau or Power BI that, well, it has several advantages. One is that it costs a lot less. And another one is that it's much easier to replicate. So I've got my templates on my dashboards and I just basically copy paste all the time my code, and that makes life a lot easier. While in Tableau and Power BI, it's a bit harder to do those type of things.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of considerations when choosing technology, but if it allows you to pivot as straightforwardly as possible from the environment you're working in already, that's pretty compelling, isn't it? Joseph J also asked, can we get links to these slides? And again, just to repeat, yes, we will circulate all of these slides to registered attendees. And if you happen to be here and aren't already registered, then just get in touch with us at UBDC and we'll make sure you can get a copy as well. I had a question just for Jaime, just to get a sense of whether there was, did you face any resistance at all in the development of the app that you described, in particular in terms of availability of data, and if so, at what point did it click with people and they realized that this was something that was valuable and it was worth engaging with?
I think we were lucky. We had a very supportive management team. There was a very clear recognition that our previous platform was not meeting our user needs, and we needed to do something about it. And our managers were very encouraging of us trying new technologies. So we were supported through the process. I think also they were very keen on making data available, and the fact that we were producing that data for ad hoc requests a lot of the time, it showcased that if we just made it public, it will just reduce our workload as well, and we could focus on other things. So that was a compelling argument as well.
Thank you. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. We've got no other questions in the chat, but
I have a question, Andrew, if I can enter it. Yeah, a question for Jaime as well. You mentioned that you've done user feedback and you asked for feedback and user engagement, sorry. And I was just curious if you could give us an example of a change that you implemented, or what sort of feedback you got that you implemented on the platform following the feedback.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of the changes were quite small about where the text that you use to describe some of the filters or some of the location of certain buttons, so it's a bit more obvious. But for example, one key one is that we had a different summary visualization that users were not really engaging with and not really understanding what they were supposed to be getting out of there. So we changed to this one, which is a lot more in your face and a lot easier to understand for the less data savvy users.
Great stuff. Thank you. Any other questions? And we will have a further opportunity for discussion at the end. But as I say, I think Jaime, we have a question actually. Will Aylward asks, as well as saying thanks to all the presenters. Jaime, do you capture the desired use cases for download requests when an offline analysis is carried out?
So I understand this when we were doing some sort of ad hoc requests. In that case, yes, we knew why our users were requesting that data and what they were going to use it for. So it was easy for us to incorporate that type of information in there. If you refer like now users downloading the data and then doing their own thing, we are in touch with the local association. It's called LARIA. It's an association of local analysts, and we work with them to understand what are the needs and how they use their data. And again, our organization as well have a lot of analysts that work on partnerships and health boards, and we work with them to understand why they are downloading our data and what they're using it for. And a lot of it is just slight variations over what we present and different compilations of things. So as different tweaks that will be too difficult to incorporate into the tool without making it too massive and too complex. But it's easy for them just to download it and present it in a slightly different way.
Okay, that's great. And please jump in if other colleagues have anything to add. The questions are flowing in now. Apologies in advance for the pronunciation. Ainara asks, is it possible to infer personal data of any of these dashboards? If so, how do you comply with privacy protection regulation when inferring these data? And I know, Jeanette, you mentioned obviously the importance of privacy. Do you and I don't think there's any privacy considerations in the specific dashboard you showcase, but how would you account for these kinds of things?
No, so the one I presented was all openly available data, so we didn't have to deal with that in that case. But yeah, I mean, actually, Jaime's probably a better person to tell you about this because you do the analyses yourself. So you actually make sure that nothing that gets put on the dashboard is sort of identifiable. But yeah, these are things that you need to consider beforehand. So in terms of who ends up analyzing the data that goes into the dashboard or where it comes from, and there will be sort of agreements in place, I'm sure, when it comes to working with this kind of data. So I know our data scientists obviously make sure that any data before it gets shared anywhere or gets visualized is sort of non-identifiable. So there's different things you can do here. I don't know if that properly answers your question, but there's lots of stuff you can do. And yeah, I mean, dashboards are essentially just visualizing data. So you want to make sure that none of the things that you're showing have these sort of issues.
Yeah, I will add to that. There's a lot of information and information governance rules over the work that we do, and we do a lot of different things to try to provide data that is not patient identifiable or personally identifiable. And you can aggregate data by years, you can aggregate data to higher geographies. So for a lot of our indicators, for example, we don't provide level at intermediate zone because it will be too disclosive. It depends a lot on the nature of your data as well. Like there's some indicators that are very sensitive, other ones it doesn't matter that you can, that is too. But also when you start to work with very small numbers, you need to think that what you're showing is going to be highly affected by random variation. And then is it going to show, is it going to provide any useful information to the users to act upon? And we, for example, took a lot of information that we had a very small geographies because the numbers were just like fluctuating like crazy. So no one could actually take any positive action about it because it's just too difficult to read.
Okay, thank you both. And the final question on the list is from Matthias, and Matthias asks, is there any push for uniformization of the dashboards, for example, between health boards across UK countries or between cities, either in terms of comparability or just spreading the idea? I can perhaps answer on behalf of the work that we've done and before asking Jaime for his thoughts. But yeah, I think this is a big priority. This is a very attractive thing to do, to not require people to reinvent wheels. The Glasgow City Region dashboard that Jeanette presented, that we built on behalf of the Intelligence Hub, was firmly around the idea of being able to compare and offer a kind of a means of comparability between different UK regions, as well as obviously facilitating the sharing and representation of information within the Glasgow City region itself. And in addition to obviously the establishment of these things as a means of connectivity, we're very keen to promote the idea of open code and open data and more accessible data to facilitate others to establish their own resources. But Jaime, I'm not sure if you have an answer to this one.
Yeah, I think that's is an interesting point. Like we are trying to be more standardized within our organization, and that's already a fairly big task. But definitely making your code available helps massively, because then people is just going to be copy pasting your code because it's quicker than developing their own one. So that helps standardization over time, and then sort of trying to create networks of people that is involved in dashboard developments helps quite a lot to keep things more consistent over time.
Lovely. Thank you very much.